Alright, let's start breaking down this lesson for movable chord licks out of the E shape. So definitely check out the lesson I did on the caged system. That's a way to understand movable chords and kind of view the fretboard. So definitely check that out first. But basically a short summary is the caged system, just C, A, G, E, D. Those are the chord shapes that we're going to think out of for playing solos. So I get a lot of questions from students of how they should practice. A lot of people spend a lot of time memorizing scales, but they don't find the practical application for those scales. Well, learning scales can be important. Kind of a more practical way to play, at least in bluegrass and jazz, is playing out of a chord shape. Sometimes they'll call it a grip. Basically like you're gripping down a specific chord, right? So that's what we're going to think about for this lesson. While we might introduce some scale ideas, we're thinking out of that chord shape. So for this lesson, we're going to start with the E shape in the cage system. I think that'll be a good one to start with. This chord shape is used from everyone from like Tony Rice and bluegrass to Charlie Christian and jazz to Telecaster players in country music. So you can get a lot of mileage out of this shape regardless of what style of music you're playing in. Okay, let's start breaking down this lesson. Here we go. So we're going to start down here in our classic E major shape. And when I move those notes up a half step, then I need to bar, right? You're probably familiar with like that bar shape. But the importance is you want to visualize this E chord. That's where we're getting that name, the E shape in the cage system. So it's just this bar chord shape that you've probably seen a lot. And the other way that you'll see this is maybe just more like this without the lowest string barred. And the other way you might see it is just like this with just 3 fingers. So I'm barring up here with my index finger. And think of all these shapes as the same. I'm just using different fingers. I'm still visualizing this E shape right here in my mind, right? So even if I do it this way, I still think of those all as the exact same chord, okay? So that's very important. So that's the shape we're going to be working out of, okay? So let's start in G because I think that'll make the most sense. So I'll show you kind of how you can apply this shape and idea to different styles of music, okay? So let's start with like kind of bluegrass and country because I think that's kind of most of my audience. And then I'll show you maybe how to do some more like jazzier ideas or kind of some country stuff if you want to work out that style of music. So remember, this is our chord shape that we're working out of. And the other thing that's very important to remember is that each note in the chord is what is called a chord tone. So those are the notes, the tones that make up a chord. And that's the important thing to remember is that that's probably where our melody notes are going to start or end, is on one of those notes. You have the root note here and here, right? So that's our absolute ending resolve. Especially for like a bluegrass style lick, you want to either end here or here. In jazz, you might end on a different note in like a different chord tone to kind of create some tension or just a different style. So you might end here on the 3rd, or you might end here on the 5th, or again, as you get more advanced, you can end on different notes. But a general basic rule is you're going to end on one of those chord tones. It's also probably where you're going to want to start the melody. So a kind of like a bluegrass application for this would be like sliding into each of those notes. And you don't even have to necessarily use the exact same fingers if you don't want to. Something like that. Or sliding into something like that. That's a very Doc Watson position. And the key is to visualize in your mind. See how even if I'm just using these top 2 fingers, I still think of that in my mind as this whole shape. So it's so much more to remember if you have to remember this as one chord, this is a different chord, this is a different chord, this. Just think of those all as G, and G in relative to your E shape, right? So like I said, this is a very Doc Watson style position. That, like you'd slide into that. And then what I do is once I'm working this shape, I start kind of exploring around with my other fingers of what notes I can grab that also work in that scale. So this is kind of where scales ideas are actually practical. Rather than just having this kind of scale that is out in the middle of outer space nowhere, if I can connect it to this chord, that's kind of I feel more grounded. Now I'm thinking out of this shape, and I can play a scale, you know, different ways. But I'm still thinking of that shape as my home base. That's very important. So one common one is if I slide up into that shape, using your ring finger on either the 3rd fret of the 3rd string, 3rd fret of the 2nd string, or 3rd fret even of the 1st string, the high E. So that'd be one thing, is just start kind of exploring around with that. Like I said, a very common, like bluegrass way would be sliding into each of those notes. Another one is like, yeah, like I said, sliding into that 3rd or hammering on. Another one, like a bluegrass way, would be playing your ring finger and then your 1st finger, but leaving that middle string open and doing like cross picking. Still, I'm just thinking out of that shape. So that's kind of like a very bluegrass way to play that shape. And you can end with open strings too, like that. A more bluegrass way would be like something like that, where I'm sliding up into that shape and then sliding back down to more open chord. But I'm still thinking out of those two shapes. I'm thinking out of this shape, and then I'm transitioning back to this G. Or like I said, sliding into those notes. Like a very bluegrass way. Something like that is like a very bluegrass style lick. Or you can land there. So what you want to practice is, if you're playing it more down here, like in a bluegrass context, you probably wouldn't move that shape around because you're losing some of your open strings, but what you would do is you would like capo, right? So a more country way would be like just taking this shape and moving it up and then playing out of A, for example, like that. Like that type of lick where I'm barring, like that style lick. But in bluegrass, you'd probably capo up, and then you're still thinking in that G shape, but now you're in the key of A because you've got your capo on, okay? So that's what I would think about for that shape. Another very common way this shape and idea is used is in like blues stuff. So you can use like minor pentatonic, something like that. So that would be like a bluesy, a common blues technique is like playing minor sounding notes over major sounding chords. So that's a good lick to practice. Just getting used to that shape. A lot of times I'll slide into that. It's very like Tony Rice. Or going from the minor third to the major third is a very bluegrass or blues idea. So I might start with that kind of minor sound, and then I go major at the end. It just depends on what kind of sound you're going for. You can go all minor. So I'm just thinking out of this shape. I'm connected in your mind. I keep mentioning that and reiterating that, but it's so important. If you just think of this scale, you might be able to remember that scale, but when you're actually in a jam session, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's going to be much less likely you can remember that. If you can get into the shape, it's more likely that your brain's going to remember it. The other thing I recommend is using similar fingers whenever possible. A common beginner mistake is taking a lick like that, moving it somewhere else, and then playing it with different fingers so it doesn't feel the same. If you use the same fingers, regardless of where I play that, just using those same fingers to connect it in my mind that it's the same lick. So that's a lick you could do. You could also slide up like that, or so that'd be like a more of a bluesy. If you want the blue note, you can slide your pinky. So that'd be more like straight blues scale. That'd be like a very Tony Rice style lick, like that backslide with your pinky on the 6th fret of the 3rd string. There's a lot of licks that work out of that shape. You can do triplets. So just play around with those ideas. You're not going to come up with something amazing right away, but the goal is to connect that shape in your mind and start hearing those different sounds that you can get out of that shape. You might even at the beginning is kind of say in your mind, like, I'm going for minor sounds, I'm going for major sounds. That'll really help your ear training as well to identify that sound that you're going after. You want to be able to hear that that's a minor sound. Like I said, that's an idea you can use. Another thing that's kind of cool is, like, instead of going straight up and down the scale, is jumping around a little bit more, like, so kind of doing some weird intervals, like, another one you could do, this is like another very Tony Rice thing, is barring on the 3rd frets and then barring on the 5th frets. It's like it's kind of a Telecaster lick as well, but that's a very Tony Rice, like that kind of sound. Move it up wherever you want. What's nice about this idea too is you don't even have to know. You could literally try to be learning along with the recording you're working on. You can literally just move that around until you find one that sounds good. You don't even necessarily have to know what chord it is. And once you find that shape, just use those same fingers. Like I said, you don't even have to know what chord it is necessarily right away. You can start playing some licks. Notice how I'm using the same fingerings, regardless of where I move that. And I'm just visualizing this shape in my mind. Okay? So that's kind of some bluegrass or bluesy ideas you can use. Remember, I don't expect you to get all this overnight. You're going to want to sit on this for a while, get used to playing out of this shape, and get used to trying some stuff. It's not all going to work. And as you get better and you get more advanced, your licks will sound better. But again, think in this position. That's really going to help you advance.